The night was thick with the smell of oil, sweat, and dust. American soldiers crouched in their foxholes, listening to the distant rumble of German armor. Somewhere in that darkness, a man walked calmly among them. No helmet, no fear, just a cigarette hanging loose from his lips. His uniform was stained, his boots scuffed, but his eyes were alive with fire. That man was Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen, the man German soldiers would come to call the devil in khaki. Before the war, Allen didn't fit the mold of the perfect officer. He wasn't polished, he wasn't political, and he certainly didn't play by the book. But when bullets started flying, that's when he became something else, something unstoppable. He'd already been written off once in his career. Back at West Point, Allen flunked out not once, but twice. To the rigid military establishment, that was supposed to be the end of his story. But for Terry Allen, failure was just an obstacle, something to smash through. He eventually clawed his way back, earned his commission, and by the time the United States entered World War II, he was ready to prove that a man's heart mattered more than his rank or pedigree. To his men, Allen was a legend. He ate with them, cursed like them, and slept in the same dirt. He wasn't the kind of general who hid behind a desk or barked orders from a safe distance. He was there, shoulder to shoulder, fighting the same fight. And that's what terrified the Germans. They weren't just facing soldiers, they were facing a leader whose men would follow him into hell without hesitation. In North Africa, 1943, that hell had a name. Kasserine Pass, the U.S. Army had been bloodied, humiliated, and nearly shattered by the German Afrika Korps. It was chaos, confusion, and fear. But Allen, commanding the First Infantry Division, the famous Big Red One, refused to back down. While other commanders hesitated, Allen's men counterattacked. Under his brutal, relentless leadership, they struck back at the Germans with a fury that changed everything. To the enemy, Allen's style was shocking. He didn't move cautiously. He moved like a street fighter. He believed in aggression, fast, overwhelming, and unpredictable, and that made him a nightmare for German commanders who were used to rigid American tactics. His philosophy was simple: hit hard, hit first, and never stop moving. But it wasn't just his tactics that made him dangerous. It was his psychology. Allen understood something that most generals didn't. Morale wins wars. When soldiers believed their leader had their back, they fought like demons. So he led from the front, laughed in the face of danger, and turned every setback into fuel for revenge. His men adored him. To them, he wasn't General Allen. He was Terrible Terry, a title said with pride, not fear. He could drink anyone under the table, curse like a sailor, and still have the clarity to outsmart his enemies when dawn broke. In the words of one soldier, he wasn't like the others. He was one of us, just tougher. And yet, that same wild spirit that made him beloved among his troops made him controversial among his peers. Higher command, especially men like General Omar Bradley, saw Allen as reckless, undisciplined, even dangerous. He didn't care about parade ground perfection or polished reports. He cared about winning. But the army wasn't always ready for men like him. Still, when it came to fighting, there was no denying his results. His division's victories in North Africa earned them a fearsome reputation. German POWs reportedly asked, "Are we fighting Allen's men?" before even setting foot on the battlefield. Because if they were, they knew it was going to be a fight to the last breath. Allen's secret weapon wasn't superior firepower or strategy. It was psychological dominance. He believed that if his men feared nothing, then the enemy would start fearing them. He cultivated an aura of relentless aggression. Tanks ran longer, infantry pushed harder, air support came faster, everything moved with the speed of his will. But there was a cost. War doesn't let men like Allen walk away untouched. The intensity that drove him also burned him from the inside. He didn't sleep much. He carried the weight of every dead man. And behind that swagger, there was always a storm. One night, a young lieutenant approached Allen, terrified of the next day's battle. Allen looked at him and said, "Son, you don't have to be brave. You just have to be mad enough not to quit." The next morning, that lieutenant led his platoon straight through a German machine gun nest. That was the kind of loyalty Allen inspired, not through orders but through raw belief. As the North African campaign came to a brutal close, the Big Red One stood victorious. The men had earned their nickname, the Bloody First, and their general had become a living legend. The Germans learned to recognize his tactics, his patterns, his fury. They began to whisper about the American general who wouldn't stop coming. The one who fought like he'd already died and didn't care. When word spread that the 1st Division was moving to Sicily, German morale dipped again. Terrible Terry was coming, And when he arrived, the battlefield would never be the same. In Sicily, Allen would cement his place in military history. But before that, he would also discover how dangerous success could be. For while he was feared by the enemy, he was being watched by his own. And not everyone in the U.S. Army liked what they saw, because the higher-ups didn't want legends, they wanted control. And men like Allen, wild, unpredictable, untamed, didn't fit neatly into that system. He was too real, too raw, too human. But on the battlefield, that was exactly what made him invincible. Sicily, July 1943. The sun beat down on the parched hills like a hammer. Dust rose in waves around the advancing columns of the First Infantry Division. Their faces were burned, their uniforms torn, but their spirits, forged in the crucible of North Africa, were unbreakable. At their head rode Major General Terry Allen, the man whose very name made German officers curse under their breath. The invasion of Sicily, code-named Operation Husky, was meant to be the next great push in the Allied march across Europe. But the terrain was treacherous, the enemy was dug in, and chaos reigned from the beaches to the mountains. And in the midst of that chaos, Allen thrived. His troops hit the beaches near Gela with fire and fury. While other divisions were slowed by confusion and bottlenecks, Allen's men cut through resistance with machine-like precision. They fought like wolves, hungry, ruthless, and united. And it wasn't by chance. Allen had drilled into them one simple truth: when you stop fighting, you start dying. In those first brutal days, German counterattacks came fast. Tanks, artillery, and paratroopers hit the American lines like a storm. But Allen's response was classic Terry. Counterattack immediately, hit harder than they expect, and never show fear. While shells exploded and the ground shook, Allen stood tall in his open jeep, cigarette in hand, shouting, "Keep moving forward." To the men watching, that image stuck forever. Their general, fearless in the chaos, almost daring death to take him. He wasn't just leading them, he was living the fight. And when soldiers saw their commander that way, something inside them ignited. The Germans learned quickly that Allen's division didn't fight fair. They didn't move by the book. They moved by instinct. Guerrilla-style tactics, surprise night raids, rapid flanking maneuvers. Things that weren't supposed to work in a modern war. But under Allen, they worked beautifully. His men adapted faster, thought quicker, and struck harder than anyone else. And soon German intelligence reports started to mention him by name. They called him the Ghost General, because he was always where they didn't expect him. They called his division Allen's Wolves. To the German high command, facing the First Infantry Division meant bracing for chaos, the kind of chaos that shattered morale before a single shot was fired. But back at Allied headquarters, not everyone was cheering. General Omar Bradley and General George S. Patton had both taken notice of Allen, but for different reasons. Patton, the fiery showman of the U.S. Army, admired Allen's aggression but hated his lack of discipline. Bradley, calm and calculating, respected Allen's results but feared his unpredictability. Allen didn't care what they thought. To him, war wasn't about medals or press photos. It was about survival. About getting as many of his men home as possible while killing the enemy fast. And that philosophy created a unique culture in his division. His soldiers didn't stand on ceremony. They didn't salute unless it meant something. They drank, fought, and joked like brothers. To outsiders, it looked like anarchy. To Allen, it was loyalty. One evening in Sicily, Allen walked into a makeshift camp where his men were singing, drinking, and telling stories. An officer nervously said, "Sir, shouldn't we impose some order?" Allen just smiled and said, "This is order, my kind." That night, German artillery opened up on the nearby ridge. Without waiting for orders, Allen's men were up, rifles in hand, returning fire before command even knew what was happening. That's the kind of unit he'd built. A division that didn't need to be told when to fight. But the very thing that made Allen's troops so effective on the battlefield also made them a target off it. Reports began reaching headquarters that his men were too wild. That discipline was slipping. There were stories of drinking, brawling, even looting. Most were exaggerated, some were true, but all landed on Bradley's desk. Bradley had a different vision for the post-war army, one built on structure, precision, and control. Allen represented the old-school warrior, a throwback to a time when courage mattered more than conformity. And for that reason, his days were numbered. Still, before any of that could unfold, Allen had one more masterpiece to deliver: the Battle of Troina. Troina was a fortress city deep in the Sicilian mountains, held by elite German units armed with heavy artillery and dug into near-impenetrable positions. The terrain was brutal: rocky ridges, scorching heat, and snipers in every shadow. Most commanders would have pulled back, regrouped, and planned for weeks. Allen didn't. He told his men, "We're going to take that damn town, even if we have to crawl." For 7 days, the Battle of Troina raged like something out of hell. Artillery turned mountains into dust. Machine guns tore through the air day and night. The Big Red One fought uphill, inch by bloody inch. Allen moved through the front lines constantly, bandaging wounded men, shouting encouragement, always visible. A soldier later recalled, "Every time we thought we couldn't move another foot, we'd see him walking past us calm as if he was on a Sunday stroll. You couldn't quit after that." By the end, Troina fell. The Germans withdrew battered and stunned. The victory came at a terrible cost. Hundreds dead, thousands wounded, but the First Infantry Division had done the impossible. Even the Germans admitted it was one of the most ferocious fights they had ever faced. The name Terrible Terry Allen spread across Europe like wildfire. His men adored him more than ever. The press wrote glowing stories, and German radio broadcasts mentioned him as the most dangerous American commander. But back in Allied command, the praise was mixed with suspicion. Bradley saw the aftermath of Troina and saw exhaustion, disorganization, and chaos. He saw a division that loved its general more than the chain of command. To Bradley, that was unacceptable. To Allen, it was the highest honor possible. In the days after Troina, while the Big Red One rested and buried its dead, Allen was called to headquarters. He arrived with dust still on his boots, unaware that his greatest victory was also his undoing. Bradley looked him in the eye and told him he was being relieved of command. Officially, the reason was disciplinary issues and lack of control. Unofficially, it was politics. Bradley wanted a more conventional leader, someone who followed the rules. Allen didn't argue. He saluted, turned around, and left without a word. But the soldiers didn't take it quietly. When word spread that Terrible Terry was gone, men cried. They gathered around his jeep as he drove away, shouting, cheering, begging him to stay. He didn't look back, because deep down he knew the kind of fire he carried could never live long inside the machinery of military bureaucracy. But that wasn't the end of Terry Allen's story. It was just the intermission, because a few years later he would return, older, harder, and even more dangerous, to lead men into one of the bloodiest wars America would ever fight. When the war in Europe raged on and the world seemed to tear itself apart, Terry Allen was far from done. The army might have removed him from the Big Red One, but they couldn't erase his name from the battlefield. He was too capable, too ferocious, too magnetic a leader to be kept away for long. And so, after months of limbo, the call came again. Another division needed a commander, one who could take broken men and turn them into a fighting machine. The division was the 104th Infantry, the Timberwolves. They weren't the elite like the 1st Division had been. They were green, untested, and hungry. And that's exactly what Allen liked. He didn't want polished soldiers. He wanted fighters. He looked them over on their first day together, saw uncertainty in their eyes, and said, "You may not be the best now, but when I'm done with you, the enemy will pray they never meet the Timberwolves." From that moment, the 104th changed. Allen instilled in them the same raw aggression, independence, and courage that had defined the Big Red One. He trained them hard, but he trained them smart. He knew war wasn't won by blind obedience. It was won by confidence, by instinct, by the willingness to keep pushing when the world turned black. His leadership philosophy was simple and brutal. You can't train men to be fearless, but you can train them to move anyway. And move they did. By the fall of 1944, Allen's Timberwolves landed in France, pushing into the heart of Nazi Germany. What awaited them wasn't the open desert of North Africa or the dry hills of Sicily. It was something worse. Endless mud, freezing cold, and the most fortified enemy positions on Earth. Yet Allen thrived again. He understood how to adapt. He turned night into his ally. While most units preferred to move under daylight, Allen pushed for night fighting. He knew the Germans feared the dark, so he trained his men to see through it, to move quietly, strike suddenly, and disappear before dawn. Soon, the 104th became known as the Night Fighters. German reports described them with unease. They come when it's black, and they don't stop. Allen's personal leadership style hadn't changed. He was still in the mud with his men, still laughing, still shouting orders from the front instead of a radio tent. Soldiers said you could always tell where the general was. You just had to listen for the voice cursing the loudest. But behind that humor and swagger was deadly efficiency. The Timberwolves advanced through Belgium and Holland faster than anyone expected. They liberated towns, captured strongholds, and faced some of the toughest German divisions left standing. In October 1944, the 104th fought alongside the Canadian First Army during the Battle of the Scheldt, a campaign critical for opening the port of Antwerp. The fighting was fierce, house to house, trench to trench, mud deep enough to swallow boots whole. Allen was everywhere. When an officer once told him the night was too dark for an assault, Allen snapped, "Perfect. Then they won't see us coming." His troops didn't just fight, they believed. They followed him not because of his rank, but because they trusted his instincts. And that trust paid off, again and again. As the Allied armies surged toward Germany, Allen's Timberwolves became one of the most reliable, respected, and lethal units in the entire U.S. Army. They crossed the Rhine in March 1945 and cut deep into enemy territory, capturing Cologne and pushing toward the Ruhr. German soldiers began surrendering en masse when they learned they were facing the 104th. Once again, Terry Allen had done the impossible. He'd taken an untested division and turned it into a force of nature. Even his critics had to admit the man knew how to win. But for all his battlefield brilliance, Allen remained an outsider in the polished halls of military politics. He didn't write memoirs, didn't seek publicity, didn't care about medals. To him, the only glory that mattered was the kind earned in blood and brotherhood. When World War II ended, Allen didn't celebrate. He visited the graves of his men instead. He sat quietly for hours smoking, staring, remembering every face. War had taken pieces of him, pieces he never got back. But it had also given him something unshakable, the loyalty of thousands who'd followed him through hell. For a time it seemed like his story would end there. The wild general who burned too bright for the system. But then, in the early 1950s, the world caught fire again. Korea, and once more, the army called on the man who'd never failed when things looked impossible. Now older, grayer, and with a reputation carved in stone, Terry Allen took command again, this time of the Second Infantry Division. The soldiers were different, the war was different. But Allen wasn't. He still led from the front. He still refused to ask anyone to do something he wouldn't do himself. Korea was savage. Mountains, freezing temperatures, ambushes, and an enemy that seemed to come out of nowhere. But even there, he adapted fast, inspired faster, and never let bureaucracy slow him down. His men adored him, just like before. Some said he was calmer, more reflective. Others swore he was even tougher. He once told a young officer who asked how to survive in war, "Don't try to be brave. Just do your damn job. Fear's fine. It means you're alive. Just don't let it tell you what to do." By the time Allen finally left the battlefield for good, he'd fought in 3 wars and led men across 2 continents. His name was etched in the DNA of the U.S. Army, whispered in barracks, studied in war colleges, remembered in the scars of the men who served under him. When he died in 1969, the soldiers who'd fought for him were old men, but they still told stories. About the general who stood in the mud with them, who never wore his helmet, who looked death in the eye and laughed. To them, Terry Allen wasn't just a general. He was proof that leadership wasn't about rank or privilege. It was about heart. Even decades later, military historians struggle to categorize him. Some call him reckless, others call him a genius. But everyone agrees on one thing: he was real. In a world of polished officers and political maneuvering, Terry Allen was raw, fearless, and unfiltered. He represented a kind of soldiering that rarely exists anymore. The kind born from grit, loyalty, and sheer willpower. And maybe that's why the Germans feared him so much. Because you can fight a strategist, outthink a tactician, even outmaneuver a planner. But you can't stop a man who refuses to die. Allen's legend didn't end with medals or monuments. It lived in the hearts of the men who followed him. They carried his lessons long after the guns fell silent. Stand tall when the world shakes. Fight for the man beside you, and never, ever back down. That's the legacy of Terrible Terry Allen, the American general who defied the system, terrified the enemy, and became the embodiment of a warrior's soul.